The Vedrak had been watching humans die for weeks, and they loved it. From the observation deck above the holding pits, they leaned on the railing like aristocrats at a gladiator show. They whispered to one another in their fluted, insectal voices, their mandibles clicking in amusement. Humanity had been dragged into the galactic light too early, they said. Too frail, too breakable. A species still smelling of soil and salt water, not yet hardened for the stars. In the pit below, another human bled out. He had been slashed across the torso with a training blade, and his shirt was dark with the slow seep of red. The crowd expected him to fall, expected him to whimper, to beg. Instead, he leaned against the wall, breathing raggedly but still upright, eyes locked on the towering predator who had struck him. The Vedrak found this funny. They found all of it funny. "Your blood abandons you," one hissed, mandibles clattering with laughter. "Even your bodies betray you. We are watching you pour yourself away." The human didn't respond. He pressed his palm to the wound, and when his hand came back slick, he smeared the blood across his face like war paint. The Vedrak leaned closer to their rail. Some laughed harder, but others grew strangely quiet. The Vedrak were a warrior caste by nature. They respected strength, speed, intimidation. But they had no frame of reference for what they were seeing, a creature refusing to collapse, even as its own body drained it dry. The fight resumed. The human staggered, swung the training blade, missed. The predator countered, struck him again, shallow but cruel. More blood, dripping now, soaking the dirt. Any other species would have been unconscious. The Vedrak knew this. The audience was beginning to murmur, why hadn't he fallen? The human kept walking forward. Not fast, not elegant. Just forward. His steps left dark prints behind him. The predator struck again. The crowd cheered. The human laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, more of a low, cracked chuckle. But in the vaulted silence that followed, it carried. The sound scraped like iron over stone. The predator hesitated, blade raised but unmoving. The human's words came ragged, chewed by pain, but every syllable landed like a weight dropped in still water. "Is that all?" Something shifted in the pit. The human should have been finished, no blood left to pump, no strength to stand. But he didn't collapse. He pressed his shoulder into the wall, pushed himself off it, and stumbled forward again, blade raised. The predator retreated. That was the first time the Vedrak felt the prickle of unease. They would deny it later, but it spread through the watching crowd like a draft of cold air. They were predators, yes, but even predators have instincts, and something deep, ancient, whispered that the thing below them wasn't prey at all. The human did fall, eventually. His body couldn't keep going forever. But he didn't fall in defeat. He dropped with his blade still raised, eyes still open, and the predator wouldn't approach the body. Not for minutes. Later, when the corpse was removed, the Vedrak argued over it. Some said humans were too stupid to recognize their limits. Others said they were too stubborn to stop even when their blood had abandoned them. A few stayed silent, replaying the image in their minds, that crimson handprint smeared across a face, that laugh rising through the pit like smoke. The overseers decided the experiment was worth continuing. More humans were brought into the pits, more blades tested against their fragile frames. Again and again, the results came back wrong. A human cut deep would stagger, yes, but they wouldn't surrender. They used walls, weapons, even each other, to keep moving. Sometimes their blood loss slowed them, sometimes it made them wild. One screamed with every exhale until his voice was nothing but shredded gasps, but he kept swinging his knife. Another dragged a broken leg behind him, leaving a long scar in the dirt, and still managed to strike his foe across the face before collapsing. The Vedrak began to notice a pattern. The more humans bled, the more terrifying they became. Not stronger, not faster. Just relentless. Their movements were stripped down, raw, stripped of hesitation. They fought like creatures who had already been told they were dead, and decided to keep going anyway. The pits turned quieter. The laughter faded. No one wanted to be the predator called down to face them anymore. One night, after a particularly brutal trial, the overseer JHYRF walked the empty corridors of the holding pens. He passed cages of other species, creatures captured from frontier skirmishes, each one docile, broken, waiting for commands. But when he reached the human section, he found silence. Rows of eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, watching him. He hissed to himself. So fragile. You will break like the rest. No answer. Not a word. Just that silence. He realized, after a moment, that every human had pressed forward against the bars, their eyes fixed on him, unmoving. Their faces were pale, some streaked with blood, but none of them looked away. That was when JHYRF felt it for the first time, not unease, not curiosity. Fear. The silence broke when one of the humans whispered, voice hoarse but steady. We don't stop. JHYRF left quickly, mandibles tight, footsteps too loud in the hall. The next cycle, the overseers decided to escalate the trials. They wanted to prove to themselves, and to the rest of the galaxy, that humanity was weak. They wanted to see them bleed out completely, to drag the mystery into the light and end it. They brought in fire. They brought in acid. They brought in claws. The humans kept moving. One predator stumbled out of the pit, shrieking, both forearms torn open. He told the overseers the human had grabbed him and refused to let go, even while dying, even while losing consciousness. He was smiling, the predator hissed, trembling. He bled all over me and he smiled. From that night, no predator volunteered for the pits. They had to be ordered. The overseers argued again, more fiercely this time. Some said humans were a threat. Others said the trials proved nothing, the subjects were few, untrained, still frail. But beneath all the words, an unspoken truth gnawed at them: prey wasn't supposed to fight like that. Prey wasn't supposed to weaponize its own suffering. The Vedrak had cracked open something they didn't understand, and the wound would not close. In the cold, sleepless hours before dawn, JHYRF returned once more to the holding pens. He told himself he came to study them, to confirm what his rational mind already knew. But when he stood before the rows of cages again, the silence pressed against him like a weight. One of the humans stepped forward. Thin, pale, lips cracked from thirst. JHYRF expected begging. What he heard instead was quiet, measured, almost conversational. You bleed too, don't you? JHYRF froze. The human smiled through split lips. We'll show you how to use it. The overseer's mandibles trembled, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know whether to laugh, retreat, or call for guards. The overseers doubled the guards around the human pens. Not because the humans had escaped, they hadn't. Not because they had risen in rebellion, they hadn't yet. No, the order came down because the predators themselves had begun refusing assignments. Warriors who once begged for the chance to toy with prey now trembled when they drew the human lots. The Vedrak were predators to their bones, raised on blood duels and hunts through their homeworld's jungle plains. Fear was supposed to be alien to them. But the word spread, quiet at first, then louder, passed from mandible to mandible. Humans don't stop. The overseers laughed it off in the war council chambers. They called it primitive bravado, the stubborn thrashings of a fragile species too dim to understand it was already beaten. But even as they dismissed the rumors, they ordered more experiments. That was how the arena trials began. No longer confined to narrow pits, the humans were herded into wide, circular killing fields, dirt, steel, fire pits around the edges. The Vedrak brought in champions now, armored, clawed, armed with ceremonial blades meant to cut through bone like paper. The first trial was meant to be a public spectacle. Hundreds gathered to watch from the tiered platforms, their clicking voices buzzing with anticipation. They wanted to see the myth broken, the stubborn prey cut down in front of them. The chosen human was a woman, wiry and pale from weeks in confinement. She stood barefoot in the dust, her chest wrapped in blood-stained cloth from old wounds. The crowd expected begging, or tears, or perhaps some desperate attempt to flee. She rolled her shoulders instead. The Vedrak champion descended into the arena with a flourish. His armor gleamed, his blade curved like a talon. He circled her once, letting the silence stretch, savoring the moment. "You will collapse quickly," he hissed. "Your blood will spill, and you will crawl in it. This ends fast." The woman said nothing. The gong sounded. The champion lunged, carving his blade across her shoulder. Flesh split open, blood pouring in a sheet down her arm. The crowd roared. It should have ended there. By Vedrak standards, the fight was over, she was marked, she was finished. But she didn't fall. She tightened her grip on the wound, crimson pouring between her fingers, and then she smiled. The champion hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. She lunged, not with grace, not with skill, but with sheer ferocity, slamming into him shoulder first. Her blood smeared across his armor, slicking the metal, staining it dark. The crowd went silent. The fight became ugly. She had no technique, no precision, only persistence. Every time he cut her, she got closer. Every drop of blood became a weapon, making his grip slip, clouding his vision. By the time he finally drove his blade deep into her chest, she was already dragging him down with her, her hands locked on his throat. Both fell into the dirt. For a long, stretched moment, no one knew who had won. Then the champion twitched, spasmed, and went still. The human lay across him, eyes open, lips curled into a grin even as blood trickled from her mouth. The silence from the crowd was absolute. The overseers called it a fluke. A statistical anomaly. But the recordings told another story, every movement, every wound, every second she refused to yield. The broadcast spread beyond the Vedrak Empire, into the channels of other species. The whispers grew louder. Humans don't stop. The trials didn't stop either. More humans were thrown into the arenas. More champions faced them. Sometimes the humans lost quickly, but not before leaving their mark, literally. Blood smeared across armor, claw marks etched into chitin, bones broken by fists that should have been too weak. And every time, even in death, they stared their killers down. No begging. No surrender. The predators started avoiding eye contact. One night, deep in the barracks, a Vedrak soldier scrubbed at his armor. He couldn't get the stain out. Human blood had seeped into the seams, dark and sticky, and no solvent burned it away. He told himself it was superstition, nonsense, but when he closed his eyes, he saw her face again. Pale, bloodied, smiling as she dragged his comrade down. He smashed the armor against the wall until it cracked. Better broken than stained. The overseers noticed the change. Discipline eroded. Warriors muttered in the halls, their mandibles clicking nervously. They sharpened their blades too often, cleaned them too late. Some drank to silence the whispers. Others stared too long into shadows, expecting eyes to look back. It wasn't the human strength that haunted them. It was the refusal. That was the true infection spreading through the empire, the realization that prey had teeth, and worse, prey that didn't care how much it bled. In the council chamber, HFY spoke what others refused to. They're teaching us something. Every trial, every wound, they're showing us how to lose. The others hissed and spat, calling it heresy, weakness, madness. But HFY saw it in their eyes. They had felt it too. The trials were supposed to prove supremacy. Instead, they became lessons the predators didn't want to learn. By the 10th arena trial, something unprecedented happened. The human didn't just survive. He won. A young man, starved and ragged, fought for nearly an hour. Every slash, every stab, should have ended him. He bled from 6 open wounds, his shirt soaked, the dirt beneath his feet black with it. But he kept walking forward. Step by step. Breath by ragged breath. The champion panicked. The predator who had sworn to end him in seconds began stumbling backward, his strikes wild, his mandibles clattering with fear. He had never fought prey that refused to die. The human took his blade, not by disarming him, not by skill, but by simply refusing to let go. He seized the champion's wrist, even as the blade drove into his side, and pried the weapon free. The predator shrieked, retreating, but the human turned the blade in his hands and drove it upward. The champion fell. The human staggered, dripping red, but he didn't collapse. He raised the blood-soaked blade toward the silent crowd, lips cracked into a grim smile. That was the image that spread across the empire. Not a human begging for life, but one bleeding, grinning, weapon in hand, daring them all to come closer. The overseers ordered the feeds cut. Too late. The myth had become fact. Humans could not be broken. And in the darkness of the holding pens that night, when the humans were dragged back to their cages, something changed. They spoke little, as always. But when they looked at one another, they didn't see prisoners anymore. They saw soldiers. And the Vedrak began to sense it. The pens felt different, heavier, charged with something invisible. Guards who once mocked and jeered now kept their distance. Their mandibles clicked nervously, their claws never far from their weapons. The predators told themselves it was containment. But in their bones, they knew the truth. The prey was learning. And one night soon, the cages would open. The Vedrak built their cages to hold beasts heavier than tanks, with jaws that could shear through steel. By design, they were indestructible. What the architects had not accounted for was persistence. The humans didn't shatter the bars. They wore them down. It began with blood. Dried, caked, layered over weeks of fights and punishments. Iron seeped into seams, into hinges, staining everything a deep rust red. Guards noticed the smell first, metallic and sharp, clinging to their mandibles even after they left the pens. Then came the sound, low, rhythmic, steady. Humans striking metal. Not once, not twice, but endlessly. A guard would pass by and hear it, knuckles on steel, bone on bars. Again and again. They never shouted, never asked for release. They just kept hitting. Hours at a time. Days. The Vedrak laughed at first. They mocked the primitive ritual. But the sound never stopped. It echoed through the corridors like a second heartbeat, slow and patient. And it began to change. Fist strikes turned into leverage, bodies pressing, twisting, working the bars millimeter by millimeter. Not with strength, but with time. The overseers didn't see the danger. They still thought of humans as broken animals. They were too busy arguing about the rumors spreading across the outer colonies, tales of prey that bled but would not die. Soldiers were starting to desert assignments, feigning illness to avoid arena duty. Entire patrols grew jumpy in the dark. And then came the night the cages opened. It wasn't dramatic. No explosions, no grand speeches. Just silence broken by a metallic snap. A single hinge, corroded with blood and sweat, gave way. The door hung crooked. And the humans inside stepped forward. The guards panicked. They had claws, blades, shock staves. The humans had nothing. But it didn't matter. The first guard to strike drove his stave into a man's ribs. Electricity arced, flesh burned, and the human crumpled. But as he fell, he seized the stave in both hands and dragged the guard down with him. The others swarmed, silent, efficient. Teeth, nails, fists. It was over in seconds. When the other guards arrived, they found nothing but blood on the floor and a bent shockstave lying in the dirt. The humans had vanished into the pen block. The overseers thought they could contain it. They sent squads of predators in with orders to flush them out. What they found instead were shadows moving through the dark, leaving streaks of blood across walls, doors, and armor. It became a nightmare of confusion. The humans didn't fight to win, they fought to bleed. Every cut, every wound, was turned into a smear on claws and chitin, into a mark on the ground. The predators began slipping in their own barracks, stumbling on floors slick with red. In the half-light of emergency torches, every stain looked like a human's handprint. The Vedrak had fought countless wars. They had battled beasts with tusks longer than their arms, machines with plasma hearts, species that fought with fire and venom. But they had never fought prey that embraced the wound. That used pain as a lure. That turned blood into a weapon. Squads sent into the pen blocks stopped returning. Their comms picked up fragments, shrieks, static, a voice whispering, "We don't stop," before the line went dead. Panic spread. Orders tangled. The overseers tried to lock down the entire complex, but the humans were already inside it, moving through ducts, shafts, corridors. Small, quiet, impossible to track. Every corridor light seemed to flicker, every shadow seemed to move. And always, there was blood. The predators tried to wash it away, to scrub it from their claws and armor. But the more they cleaned, the more it spread. It wasn't just on the floors anymore, it was on the walls, the ceilings, smeared in deliberate streaks. Warnings, or marks, or simply proof, we are still here. One overseer, panicked, demanded a purge. Burn the entire block, erase the evidence, kill every human inside. But by then, it was too late. The humans had learned. They no longer charged blindly into blades. They waited. They struck in silence, from behind, from below. They turned the predator's own weapons against them. They didn't scream, didn't taunt. They simply bled, moved, and struck again. A squad commander staggered into the council chamber one night, his armor cracked, his mandibles trembling. He carried his shock stave in both hands, but it was broken, bent into a crooked spear. His chest was smeared with blood, not his own. They smile when they die, he rasped, his voice shaking. They smile. The chamber fell silent. By then, the story had spread far beyond the prison. Whispers carried by deserters, by smugglers, by terrified warriors fleeing their posts. The Vedrak Empire had uncovered a truth they couldn't bury. Humans didn't stop. And worse, humans could escape. The overseers held an emergency conclave. Voices clashed, mandibles clicked, claws struck the stone table. Some demanded extermination, glass earth, burn the colonies, erase the species before the infection spread. Others argued that would only make them martyrs. JHYRF said nothing at first. He only remembered the words whispered in the pen block. You bleed too, don't you? We'll show you how to use it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tight. It's already too late. Because even as he said it, alarms echoed through the complex. Red lights bathed the council chamber. The columns crackled with static, then with a sound that froze every predator in place. Not a scream. Not a cry. Laughter. Human laughter, distorted by the comms, echoing through every corridor like a curse. The overseers rose in panic. Some shouted orders, others fled for weapons. But JHYRF stayed still, mandibles locked in silence. He understood what the others refused to admit. The cages hadn't been broken open. The humans had let themselves out. And they were still bleeding. The Vedrak had designed the prison complex as a fortress of order. Corridors wide enough for war beasts, doors sealed by triple lock systems, surveillance nodes covering every angle. Nothing was supposed to survive inside without permission. But the system had been built for predators, not prey. And the humans weren't surviving. They were hunting. At first, the overseers tried to flood the corridors with light, to burn away the shadows. But the humans had already learned the layouts, memorized the blind corners and the maintenance shafts. They moved where the light couldn't reach, dragging bodies into the dark, leaving only streaks of blood behind. Every recovery team that entered came back smaller, if they came back at all. One patrol staggered into the muster hall, their commander limping, his armor dented and slick. His squad was gone. They let us follow them, he stammered, mandibles clattering. They bled on the floor, left a trail. We thought it was weakness. His voice cracked into a hiss. It was bait. The hall fell silent. Every predator felt the chill of recognition. They had used that tactic themselves on lesser prey. To see it turned back on them felt like a mockery. The overseers ordered gas released into the ducts, chemical floods that should have suffocated anything organic. Hours later, the readings came back. The humans were still alive. Some had passed out. Others dragged them to safety, mouths pressed to vents, lungs straining, refusing to die. And when the gas cleared, they were waiting. The predators began whispering of ghosts. Of humans walking through poison, eyes bleeding, skin blistered, still smiling as they came forward. The whispers grew with every encounter. JHYRF didn't call them ghosts. He called them what they were, soldiers. Untrained, underfed, half-dead, but soldiers all the same. And soldiers don't stay in cages. The humans shifted tactics. They no longer fought in packs. They broke apart, pairs and singles moving through the ducts, the crawlspaces, the shadows. A claw strike might take one down, but before the predator could catch breath, another would slam into him from behind, teeth tearing at soft tissue. The predators began to hesitate before stepping into the dark. Their mandibles clicked nervously, their blades slick with sweat. Some froze entirely, claws shaking too badly to grip their weapons. The humans noticed. They didn't gloat, didn't taunt. They simply bled on purpose, cutting themselves shallow, leaving trails that led into ambushes. They turned their wounds into warnings, we are still here, and we will not stop. The prison became a maze of dread. Every corridor a trap. Every door a question. Every patch of blood a choice, follow, or turn back. More and more, the predators turned back. The overseers saw discipline cracking. Warriors who had once slaughtered prey without thought now flinched at shadows, snapped at noises, abandoned posts. Some sealed themselves inside barracks and refused to leave. Others disappeared entirely, dragged screaming into the vents. The humans had no weapons but what they stole. A shockstave here, a knife there. And yet, in their hands, everything became a blade. Steel plates ripped from walls, jagged and blood-slick. Bones sharpened against stone. Even their own blood, smeared across eyes and mouths of predators mid-fight, blinding them long enough for the kill. Every encounter taught them something new. Every wound became another lesson. The predators tried fire next. Flamethrowers roared down the corridors, licking through the vents, painting the prison in orange. For a moment, the overseers believed it was finished. No creature could survive in that inferno. But when the flames died, the laughter returned. It echoed through the vents, hoarse and ragged, but unmistakable. The predators began to break. Some tried to flee the complex entirely, abandoning their posts. The overseers executed a few as examples, but it didn't stop the rot. Fear was spreading faster than orders could contain it. And through it all, the humans kept moving. They didn't fight for escape anymore. They fought for momentum. Step by step, wound by wound, they carved through the prison like water through stone. One overseer recorded a feed, intending to send it to the high command as proof. The footage showed a corridor slick with blood, the walls streaked in handprints. At the far end, a human emerged, barefoot, chest heaving, a blade stolen from a fallen guard in his hand. He was bleeding from the stomach, leaving a trail behind him. He should have collapsed. Instead, he kept walking. Slow. Steady. Unstoppable. The predator on the other end of the corridor fired his shock rifle. The human staggered, spasmed, but didn't fall. He took another step. And another. The predator fired again and again, mandibles clicking in panic. The human bled more with each hit, crimson soaking his legs, dripping from his fingertips. And still, he kept walking. By the time he reached the predator, the rifle was empty. The human drove the blade upward into his throat, blood spraying across the lens. The feed cut there. The overseer who tried to transmit it never made it to the comms array. His body was found later, stripped of armor, smeared with crimson handprints. The transmitter was gone. It wasn't just survival anymore. The humans were learning control. Learning to choose their ground, their kills, their message. And the message was clear. You can cut us. You can burn us. You can drown us in our own blood. We don't stop. That was the night HFY stopped sleeping. He sat in the dark of his chamber, claws trembling, every creak in the walls a warning. He replayed the words over and over, whispered once in the pens. You bleed too, don't you? The overseers called for reinforcements. War beasts, siege armor, entire platoons. But by then, it didn't matter. The prison was no longer theirs. It belonged to the humans. And the only question left was how far they would carry the blood with them when they finally stepped outside. The prison walls had been built to contain war. They ended up bottling something else entirely. When the breach came, it wasn't explosive or sudden. It was a slow collapse, like a bone splintering from within. Systems stopped responding one by one, doors that no longer sealed, cameras that showed nothing but static, alarms that wailed endlessly until they were silenced. By the time the overseers realized, the humans weren't inside the prison anymore. They were everywhere. The first reports came from the landing pads. A supply freighter docked, its crew expecting the usual handoff of cargo and processed prisoners. Instead, they were met by silence. Then, out of the bay's shadows, figures emerged, barefoot, blood-streaked, weapons scavenged from fallen guards. The freighter crew laughed at first. Starving humans? Half dead, covered in wounds? Nothing to fear. Their laughter didn't last long. The humans didn't charge. They didn't shout. They simply moved forward, slow and steady, bleeding on the deck plating, eyes locked on the armed crew. Every shot that landed only staggered them, but none of them fell. When they reached the crew, the fight turned wordless and ugly. Hours later, the freighter lifted off again. But it wasn't under Vedrak command. The infection was spreading. In the outer colonies, news of the prison's fall was hushed, censored, buried. But rumors didn't need truth to take root. Soldiers whispered about crimson trails in the dark, about prey that turned wounds into weapons. On patrol, some claimed to hear footsteps behind them where none should be, laughter crackling over empty comms. Discipline unraveled. Warriors trained to sneer at fear now found their claws shaking when they drew lots. Whole platoons went missing, abandoning posts rather than risk redeployment to the prison sector. And every deserter carried the rumor further: humans don't stop. The overseers tried to crush the fire with force. They dispatched war beasts, hulking brutes bred for slaughter, armored hides resistant to blades and plasma. The beasts stormed the prison complex, jaws wide, claws scraping the walls. They came back limping. The handlers who survived spoke in broken whispers. The humans had swarmed the beasts like ants on prey. They didn't fight clean, they blinded eyes, tore at joints, drove jagged steel into soft spots. Some let themselves be taken in the jaws, forcing the beasts to thrash, leaving their throats exposed for the others to finish. The handlers said the worst part wasn't the ferocity. It was the silence. The humans didn't scream when the jaws closed. They kept clawing until the last breath. The war beasts refused to enter the prison again. HFY stood in the council chamber as reports piled higher. He saw the cracks widening not just in the prison, but in the empire itself. The Vedrak had ruled for centuries through dominance, through the certainty that predators stood above prey. But humans had twisted that certainty into a blade and turned it back on them. Fear is spreading faster than they are, he said, voice low. And fear kills empires. No one wanted to admit he was right. But no one argued either. The humans pushed outward, one corridor at a time, one ship at a time. They weren't fast. They weren't coordinated. But they were relentless. Every loss became a lesson, every wound a warning. They learned how to move through ducts, how to choke supply lines, how to seize weapons before they were fired. They bled on everything they touched. And soon, blood became their calling card. Ships that went dark were later found drifting, their hulls smeared with handprints, their crews torn apart. Outposts lost comms, and when reinforcements arrived, all they found were red stains leading into the wilderness. The Vedrak tried to paint humans as diseased, as weak, as fragile vermin. But every broadcast cut short by laughter, every commander who vanished into the dark, every corpse that bore those handprints told a different story. The galaxy was watching. Other species, long cowed under Vedrak rule, listened to the whispers. They had been prey too. They knew what it meant to bleed, to survive despite it. And for the first time in centuries, they saw a mirror of themselves fighting back. Not with fleets. Not with fire. With endurance. The overseers ordered the extermination protocols prepared. Burn Earth, glass every colony, erase the infection before it spread further. But even as the orders were drafted, a message leaked. Not a broadcast, not propaganda. A single line of human speech, carried on hijacked comms across half a sector. We don't stop. Simple. Defiant. Unmistakable. It spread like wildfire. Not just among humans, but among every prey species who had ever cowered under predator rule. The overseers tried to jam it, to silence it. But the more they tried, the louder it grew. And in the heart of the prison sector, HFY sat in silence, mandibles locked tight. He could still smell the blood in the air, metallic and sharp, clinging to his senses no matter how he tried to shake it. He remembered the whisper in the cages. You bleed too, don't you? The overseers believed extermination would solve it. But HFY knew the truth. The humans weren't spreading because they were strong. They were spreading because they had already lost everything worth taking. And a creature with nothing left to lose doesn't stop. The council chamber shook as alarms flared again. Another freighter lost. Another outpost dark. And over the calms, through static, through shrieking interference, came the sound that froze every predator in place. Not words this time. Breathing. Ragged. Blood-choked. Endless. And then, after a long silence, a whisper. We're coming. The first fleet arrived in silence, its hulls blotting out the stars, banners of the Vedrak Empire burning red across the void. 70 warships, armored to withstand sieges that lasted decades, bristling with weapons designed to peel planets bare. Their admirals laughed at the idea that prey had escaped a cage. A cinderstorm would solve it. A lesson, etched in fire. But when their cannons fired, they found nothing. The prison was already abandoned, its towers gutted, its foundations scarred. The humans hadn't stayed to defend. They had slipped away into the dark. The admirals called it cowardice. Then their ships began to vanish. One by one. First, a destroyer lost contact during a patrol sweep. Then another, leaving only static on the comms. When a cruiser jumped to investigate, they found nothing but debris, shredded hull plating drifting in silence, decks painted in red handprints that spelled no words but carried meaning all the same. Bleed and keep moving. That became the pattern. The Vedrak struck hard, the humans were gone. The predators spread wide, the humans slipped between them. No decisive battles. No charges. Only attrition. And the strangest part? Every time they thought they had cornered the prey, the humans bled for it openly, deliberately. Boarding parties reported prisoners charging into fire without armor, taking hits that should have ended them, only to crawl forward anyway, dragging claws and teeth into their enemies' throats before collapsing. They left trails of blood in corridors, not by accident, but by design, slick traps that sent Vedrak stumbling, slipping, blinding sensors with heat and mess. What the Empire read as weakness was something else entirely. Weaponized loss. Every wound slowed them, but never stopped them. The admirals convened in fury. It isn't possible, one snarled. They cannot win without fleets, without firepower. Another whispered the thought no one dared voice: they don't need to win. They only need to bleed. The first desertions began soon after. Entire crews refused to board their ships, claiming to hear human breathing in the dark between bulkheads. Some slit their own throats rather than be deployed. The admirals executed them as cowards, but executions only fed the whispers. Every soldier asked the same question: what happens if the prey refuses to die? The Vedrak response was brute force. They burned colonies suspected of harboring humans. They salted worlds with plasma storms. They made examples of sympathizers. And yet, the humans only grew bolder. They raided fuel depots, leaving behind survivors maimed but alive, so they could crawl back with tales of men and women half dead, fighting with nothing but jagged steel in their bare hands. They hit communication hubs, hijacking broadcasts just long enough to let a voice slip through. You think pain ends us? You've never met us. The Empire silenced the signal, but it was too late. Whole sectors carried the phrase in whispers. Bleed and keep moving. JHYRF watched as the Empire tried to fight shadows with fire, and failed. He understood better than most. He had seen their eyes, hollow and unbreaking, even when bones jutted from their skin. The Vedrak were built on dominance, on the spectacle of power crushing resistance. But how do you crush something that turns being crushed into fuel? The answer was simple. You don't. The First Fleet limped home with less than half its number. Not destroyed, eroded. Ships lost to ambushes, crews lost to terror, machines sabotaged by hands that bled into their gears. The humans hadn't matched them in fire. They had outlasted them in suffering. And worse, the galaxy had watched. Other species, those who had bent knee and claw to the empire, saw the cracks widen. They whispered that maybe, just maybe, predators could bleed too. The overseers declared total war. Humans were no longer prisoners, no longer vermin. They were contagion. Entire legions were dispatched with orders to burn every trace. But by then, the contagion was no longer just human. The message had spread. To every slave race, to every oppressed species who had dreamed of defiance. They carved it into walls, painted it in blood, carried it in the silence before execution. Bleed and keep moving. It was more than defiance. It was a mirror. And when prey sees a mirror of itself surviving, something dangerous awakens. The overseers couldn't kill it with war. But they would try. JHYRF knew what was coming. He knew fleets would burn, worlds would fall, billions would die. But he also knew something the Council refused to see. Every battle the humans fought made them stronger. Not in numbers. Not in weapons. In will. And the Vedrak had already lost the one thing they thought untouchable, their certainty. The war beasts would not enter human-held zones. Soldiers muttered prayers before patrols. Admirals kept their claws clenched to hide the tremors. For the first time in centuries, predators remembered what it meant to fear the dark. The council chamber erupted as news came in. One of the core fleet's flagships had gone silent. Not in battle, not in ambush. Silent, as though swallowed whole. And when its emergency beacon finally flared, broadcasting across half the empire, it carried no distress call. Only breathing. Slow. Ragged. Endless. And then, a whisper the whole galaxy heard. You bleed too. The extermination fleets arrived not with siege horns, but with silence. No declarations. No demands. Just fire. Worlds that had whispered the human creed bleed and keep moving were erased in hours. Plasma storms scoured cities to glass. Seas boiled. Skies turned to ash. The Empire had always ruled with terror, but this was different. This was panic disguised as power. JHYRF sat in the chamber, mandibles tight as report after report bled across the holodeble. 5 colonies gone in a single cycle. Not contested. Not defended. Simply burned until nothing remained. But even fire has a flaw. When the fleets moved on, they left silence. No survivors, no voices. And yet, somehow, the message still spread. On the glassed worlds, search parties later found them, humans staggering through the wastelands, skin split by heat, lungs shredded by ash, still walking. Not armies. Not fleets. Just individuals. One was found dragging himself across molten rock, hands burned to bone, still clawing forward until his body gave out. Another was discovered in the ruins of a drowned city, chest caved in, whispering a single phrase through blood. We're not gone. The overseers didn't understand. They couldn't. Predators measured survival by strength, by teeth, by armor. They thought burning a planet ended a people. But humans carried survival differently. In blood. In memory. In the act of refusing to stop, even when stopping was mercy. The more the empire burned, the more stories spread. A child pulling her shattered mother through a storm of ash. A soldier with both legs severed dragging himself into a comb tower and broadcasting one last laugh before fire consumed him. A convoy of survivors walking through the desert, leaving a red trail behind them like a banner. Every massacre birthed a myth. And the myths bled further than fire could reach. Vedrak commanders began to notice it among their own troops, the tremor in their claws, the hesitation before pulling a trigger. They executed soldiers for cowardice, but the rot was spreading faster than fear could be punished. Because soldiers are still living things. And living things know dread when they smell it. The humans had become dread incarnate. The Empire unleashed weapons not meant for war, but for obliteration. Bioplagues, nerve swarms, the kind of horrors meant to erase species from the record. They infected oceans, seeded crops, poisoned air itself. And yet again, the reports trickled in. Humans walking with skin blistered and peeling, still breathing through ruined lungs. Entire camps choking on the nerve gas, laughing through blood until their throats collapsed. One commander whispered what others had begun to think: they're not fighting us. They're teaching us to bleed. The extermination fleets grew more ruthless. Where one world resisted, 10 were annihilated in reprisal. But with every world burned, another whispered the human creed. Other species began carving it into walls, into their own skin, into the bones of their dead. Bleed and keep moving. It stopped being a human phrase. It became universal. And that terrified the overseers more than anything else. JHYRF saw the fear spreading at the highest levels. He had once mocked humans for their fragility, their small frames, their endless bleeding. Now he saw what the bleeding meant. It wasn't weakness. It was persistence made visible. A promise etched in every red smear they left behind. The predators burned entire planets, and still the humans came crawling out of the ash. What kind of prey survives extinction? The council chamber felt a silence when the next transmission came through. It wasn't intercepted, it was delivered, hacked into every channel across the sector. The feed showed nothing but black for long moments. Then, faintly, a figure emerged. A human, barely recognizable. Flesh charred, one arm missing, the other slick with blood. He stood swaying in the dark, eyes sunken but alive. His voice cracked, but carried weight enough to freeze every predator who heard it. "You burn our worlds," he coughed, blood spraying the lens. "But you forgot one thing." He leaned closer. His lips pulled back in something that wasn't a smile. "You burn too." The feed cut. And for the first time in living memory, the Vedrak Council did not cheer war. They sat in silence, listening to their own breathing, wondering if somewhere out there a human was listening back. The alarms shattered the stillness. Another fleet had gone dark. Not destroyed. Not burned. Just gone. And when the beacon finally flared, carrying its final broadcast, the Empire's most hardened predators trembled. Not because of screams, but because of silence. Then, faintly, the sound began, wet, labored, unending. Breathing. The extermination fleets were supposed to end the infection. Instead, they became its veins. Every time the Empire burned a world, humans slipped through the cracks, survivors clinging to shattered ships, smuggled in supply convoys, hidden among corpses that predators couldn't stomach searching too closely. They spread not like an army, but like blood spilled across water, seeping into every corner. And wherever they went, silence followed. Stations went dark, not from bombardment, but from within. Fuel lines cut. Oxygen bled into void. Weapons bays sabotaged. Not with precision. Not with fleets. With hands. With teeth. With persistence that never stopped, even when bones cracked and lungs filled with blood. The Vedrak called them vermin. They meant it as insult. But vermin are what you can't kill fast enough, what keeps coming back no matter how many traps you lay. Vermins win by outlasting kings. The Empire started bleeding faster than it could cauterize. Ships disappeared between jumps, their trackers later found broadcasting nothing but the sound of human laughter. Garrisons reported skirmishes that never ended, hit-and-run raids by half-dead figures who left trails of red behind them like arrows pointing deeper into the dark. Soldiers deserted, whole battalions breaking ranks, some whispering that every step felt like treading in blood. For the first time, the Vedrak were not the hunters. JHYRF saw the truth as others denied it. Every extermination, every burning world, wasn't killing humans. It was feeding them. Giving them more fire, more fury, more reason to crawl out of the ash. Pain wasn't extinguishing them, it was multiplying them. It was turning endurance into offense. The first true strike came not against an outpost or patrol, but against a fortress world, one of the Empire's core anchors. Defended by legions, wrapped in orbital rings, armed to the teeth. It should have been unassailable. Instead, it fell from the inside. Weeks of silence preceded the collapse. Systems failing one by one, ventilation clogged with blood, food stores spoiled by contamination no one could explain, calms filled with phantom breathing that drove whole crews to madness. When the gates finally opened, it wasn't under assault from fleets. It was humans, staggering forward, eyes hollow, bodies cracked but moving still. The defenders broke before a single shot was fired. The Empire called it sabotage, treachery, a freak occurrence. But more fortresses fell. More strongholds turned to hollow shells filled with handprints on the walls. The humans weren't conquering. They weren't ruling. They were breaking the will of predators, bleeding them until command itself became impossible. Every loss was written not in statistics, but in whispers. A captain who saw red handprints on her own command chair before dawn. A warbeast found strangled in its pen by a human who had been gutted 3 days earlier. A flagship whose crew slit their own throats after hearing laughter over the comms that wouldn't stop. The humans were inside everything. And the overseers began to realize it too late. Predators had always ruled by fear. But humans had flipped the scale. Fear was no longer the weapon of the strong. It was the contagion of the weak. And the Empire was drowning in it. JHYRF sat alone in his quarters when the next message came through, not as a broadcast, not as an attack, but as a whisper through his private comms. It was human. I told you, the voice rasped. You bleed too. He froze. His chambers were sealed, secured by 1,000 protocols. And yet, there it was breathing, ragged and endless, filling the silence until it seemed the walls themselves inhaled with him. He wanted to answer, to curse, to scream. But he said nothing. Because he realized something the overseers refused to face. This wasn't a war anymore. It was a transfusion. The humans weren't fighting the Empire. They were feeding on it, bleeding it dry, turning its own strength into the very fuel that carried them further. And JHYRF knew the truth, predators could be killed. But something that feeds on death itself? That can only spread. The alarm klaxons shattered the stillness. Another fortress world gone dark. Another fleet collapsing not under fire, but under silence. And this time, the signal that followed didn't come from hidden humans. It came from deserters. Whole battalions throwing down their arms, scrawling the human creed in their own blood across the hulls of their ships. Bleed and keep moving. The infection wasn't human anymore. It was everyone. The empire had been built on a promise: predators do not falter. Claws never slip. Blood runs only one way. That promise was broken. Deserters streamed in from the front, claws still wet from carving their commanders. Ships that once flew the Empire's banners now drifted with their hulls smeared in red handprints, as if wearing scars instead of colors. Entire sectors ceased responding to orders, not because they were destroyed, but because no one answered the summons of fear anymore. The overseers screamed treason. But treason requires choice. What spread now wasn't choice. It was infection. The creed of prey. Bleed and keep moving. It passed from whispers to shouts, carved into walls, painted in blood on the floors of command chambers. Garrisons sang it before execution. Whole legions knelt not to pray for victory, but to whisper it before battle, as though the words themselves could turn pain into strength. And they could. The humans had proved it. Every Vedrak commander knew the truth, even as they lied to themselves. It wasn't fleets they were fighting anymore. It was an idea. And you cannot burn an idea to ash. But they tried. They threw fleets into the void, desperate to crush the infection at its heart. And yet, every time they struck, the humans were already gone, or worse, already inside. Ships turned against each other, crews slaughtering one another in paranoia, convinced the humans had already boarded. Sometimes they were right. More often, they weren't. But the humans didn't need to be everywhere. They only needed the predators to believe it. And belief was bleeding the empire dry. JHYRF moved through corridors heavy with silence, the air thick with a stench that wasn't smoke, wasn't blood, but something worse, fear so sharp it tasted metallic. He had once walked proudly as a predator among prey. Now his claws clicked too loudly, every echo reminding him of the sound he dreaded most. Breathing. He wasn't the only one. High admirals clutched their throats in their sleep, convinced they heard ragged breaths behind them. Soldiers sealed their helmets tighter, afraid of hearing laughter in the combs. War beasts howled and refused to fight, rolling in their pens as though shadows themselves had teeth. The empire was fracturing under its own heartbeat. And still, the humans kept coming. Not in fleets. Not in waves. Just in endless trickles, each drop of blood finding cracks in the dam. They moved through systems like disease, cutting arteries the empire didn't even know it had. Supply lines snapped. Communication relays went dark. The more the overseers tightened their claws, the more blood slipped through. And worse, other species began rising. Not in organized rebellion yet, but in quiet refusals. Work slowed. Rations vanished. Prisoners escaped with suspicious ease. For centuries, they had been prey, bowing beneath fangs. Now they straightened their spines, whispering the human creed. The Vedrak could smell it, the shift of the galaxy itself. predators were no longer predators. They were bleeding. In the council chamber, voices rose in panic. Some demanded genocide, others retreat, still others surrender. But over all of it was the silence of JHYRF, watching the cracks widen into chasms. He remembered the first cage he had seen a human in, frail and broken, whispering through blood. "You bleed too, don't you?" At the time, he had laughed. Now, he understood. The laughter had been theirs all along. Reports poured in. Another fortress gone. Another fleet abandoned. Entire sectors chanting the creed in unison before turning on their overseers. And then came the broadcast. Not human this time. Vedrak. A commander's voice, raw, trembling, carrying across every channel in defiance of his own empire. "They don't stop," he rasped. "I watched them bleed through fire. I watched them crawl through gas. They don't stop. And now neither do we." The feed cut to static, but the damage was done. The fracture was complete. Civil war had begun. And through the chaos, through the silence and screams alike, came the sound that had haunted every predator since the first prison breach. Breathing. Endless. Relentless. Unstoppable. The humans weren't winning battles anymore. They were watching predators destroy themselves. And JHYRF, sitting in silence, finally realized the nightmare truth. This was never about humans conquering. This was about humans teaching the galaxy one lesson. Pain is not weakness. It's the weapon you never saw coming. The alarms blared again. Another fleet gone dark. Another system lost. And in the void between stars, a voice carried, cracked and blood-choked, but clear. "We are still here." The Empire had always imagined its end would come in fire. A rival fleet. A greater predator. Some clash of claws and fangs that would etch its death into the stars. But fire didn't end them. Bleeding did. World by world, fleet by fleet, they unraveled. Not under assault, not under conquest, but under the steady erosion of prey that refused to die. The Vedrak banner, once a symbol of unbroken dominance, now hung in tatters, smeared with red handprints. And everywhere, those words whispered louder. Bleed and keep moving. Civil war split their legions. Some still clung to the old creed of claws and fire, but more and more laid down arms, not in surrender, but in defiance. They no longer obeyed predators. They obeyed endurance. The overseers tried to flee. Their fleets abandoned the core to shadows, scattering into the void, hoping to outpace the infection. But endurance doesn't chase. It follows. Slow. Steady. Unending. The humans were already there. JHYRF knew it before the others. He saw the council chambers emptied, overseers clawing each other in panic, each afraid the breathing was already in the walls. He walked those halls alone, the silence heavier than any roar. And in that silence, he finally understood. This was never about humans rising to become predators. They had no claws. No armor. No fleets. They had something worse. They had turned suffering into strategy. Pain into a creed. Bleeding into a weapon sharper than any blade. And now the galaxy carried it forward. He could see it spreading. Slave races standing tall, their wounds unhidden, wearing scars as banners. War beasts refusing commands, their handlers trembling at shadows. Vedrak soldiers carving red handprints into their own armor, whispering the human creed as if it were a prayer. Pray no longer meant weak. Pray meant enduring. And predators had no answer for that. The last of the great fleets died not in battle, but in silence. Found adrift, empty of life, hulls streaked with blood, every console marked with handprints. No human body aboard. Only breathing recorded on every channel, faint, ragged, endless. When the overseers' names were finally spoken, it was not with fear. It was with laughter the kind humans had left behind, carried by those who once cowered. The empire bled out, and no one stopped it. And through the ruins, the humans walked. Not triumphant. Not victorious. Just walking, as they always had, step by step, through blood and fire, refusing to stop. They carried no crowns, claimed no thrones. They left only trails of red, reminders etched into every surface they touched. JHYRF, last of the council, watched them pass in silence. He wanted to sneer, to mock, to curse them as vermin. But he couldn't. Because when he looked at them, broken and bleeding but still moving, he felt the one thing predators were never meant to feel. Hope. And dread, all at once. The galaxy would never be the same. Not because humans conquered it, but because they had taught it the one lesson no predator ever dared to learn. Strength isn't teeth. Strength isn't fire. Strength is standing back up when you shouldn't. Strength is bleeding, and moving anyway. In the centuries that followed, no one remembered the names of the overseers. No one carved statues of Vedrak fleets. But in every shadowed corner of every world, on walls, on skin, on steel, one phrase remained, carried in whispers and in blood. Bleed and keep moving. The creed of humanity. The creed of survival itself. And somewhere, in the silence between stars, that breathing still echoed ragged, unending, eternal. Not prey. Not predator. Something far worse. Something that never stops.